Tonight, the Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas becomes neutral ground, where Americans from all political persuasions can gather to hear compelling intellectual arguments from both sides of critical issues. Tonight's topic: all U.S. combat forces should be withdrawn from Iraq by May 2010. Our advocate for the proposal is Pedro Irigaray. Our advocate against, Fred McClure. I'm Bill Curtis, your moderator and host, and we will begin with Mr. Irigaray's opening statement.
Mr. Curtis, Mr. McClure, ladies and gentlemen, the United States should remove its combat forces from Iraq by May of 2010. The question that one must ask is why? And clearly that answer has to be based on what is in the best interest of the United States, what is in the best interest of the region, and what is in the best interest of our international community. To answer that question for you tonight, I am privileged to be able to present two experts. My first expert, Dr. Michael Moser, a professor at the Advanced School of Military Science here at Fort Leavenworth. Dr. Moser's presentation will involve three areas. First, that the Iraqi security must be performed by Iraqis. Secondly, Dr. Moser will present his opinions that the United States must shift from a combat position to one of strategic overwatch. A strategic overwatch position is one that would allow us to keep an eye on Iraq and ensure there are no foreign incursions. And thirdly, Dr. Moser will discuss Clausewitz philosophy, the manner in which a nation carries its policies, war being an extension of policy. I will then call on General Lewis Weber. General Weber will testify, first of all, about the ability of Iraq to defend itself. Secondly, he will define for you what the withdrawal is. He will then talk to you about how, as a military, that goal of withdrawing from Iraq can be achieved. And finally, with his expertise on Arab issues, General Weber will discuss with you what he expects will occur in Iraq after our withdrawal. The most important decision a nation can make is when and how to use its most precious resource, the blood of its soldiers, to resolve political issues. It is time for our American troops to come home. It is time for us to let Iraq take care of itself.
Thank you, Mr. Irigaray. And now, from the opposing side, Fred McClure.
Mr. Curtis, Mr. Irigaray, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The execution of an unconditional disengagement in Iraq through a rapid withdrawal of U.S. combat forces on a fixed timetable of any day, without regard to conditions on the ground, without regard to the behavior of the parties involved in Iraq, is the surest way to undermine any prospects of hope now emerging in that region. During this period of relative calm, we must do all that we can to ensure that Iraq does not squander this moment by failing to reach the difficult political accommodations that they face. A fixed timeline for withdrawal not only foments an environment for a resurgence of violence, but it also removes any leverage whatsoever that the Iraqi government has to effect these political accommodations. It also removes any leverage the Iraqi government has on the pace of coalition forces redeployment. At the same time, the Iraqi government must have the support of enough forces in the near term so as to prevent a major reversal of the progress that has been made to date on security. Fixed dates remove the flexibility for coalition commanders to follow up on battlefield success and to maintain security. A fixed date allows the enemy from without or within to rest and just wait for that day, the day after, returning with renewed strength and fewer obstacles. The war in Iraq is winnable, and a condition-based withdrawal allows coalition governments to establish the terms of victory, taking into consideration the cultural and political needs of the region, including acceptance in the Arab world that the Iraqi government is standing on its own. A comprehensive economic, diplomatic, and ideological effort is essential, and these are the conditions on the ground that should dictate the withdrawal. By its very strength alone, the threat of withdrawal is enough.
Mr. McClure? The duration of the war in Iraq is now longer than the U.S. participation in World War II. How the United States chooses to conclude its participation in this war is our question tonight. On the surface, the question appears simple. Should the United States withdraw its combat forces from Iraq by 2010? Is concluding a war the same as winning a war? Winning the nation's wars includes, as it really always has, reestablishing conditions for peace. The Operation Iraqi Freedom Land Operation Plan, known as Cobra II, advocated a U.S. force that would transition from U.S.-led combat operations to support operations for Iraqi forces. This transition was meant to ensure the defeat of enemy units that fought against the United States-led coalition while preserving as much as possible the infrastructure of Iraq. War is not simple, and the line between operational combat forces and support forces can be fluid. Sometimes an operation will mean the defeat of the enemy force, the occupation of its former base or city. At other times, an operation will restore security to a region or perhaps the entire country and include making emergency repairs to vital infrastructure, thus establishing conditions for the return of private industry and non-governmental organizations who can better continue the process of recovery. In war's fluid environment, the recognition of the simple solution is a very difficult art. The simple thing on one side of our discourse is a straight withdrawal from Iraq over time. Withdrawal from Iraq by a fixed date will not be easy, but has the benefit of seeing an end to U.S. operations. The corresponding impetus to the handover is the knowledge on the part of the Iraqi security forces and government that there is a commitment to leave the forces in as good a position vis-a-vis the insurgents as possible, but a commitment to leave nonetheless. The greater commitment is to the Iraqi people, that the U.S. forces are not occupiers and will leave Iraq for Iraqis. The simple thing on the other side of our discourse is that fixing a date for withdrawal is not the best course of action for the Republic. The better course of action is to establish mutually agreed upon decision criteria that identify decisive points where U.S. and Iraqi commanders will evaluate conditions on the ground and then decide that a reduction in forces is possible. Security will be sustained over time, and as Iraqi forces become better suited for operations in Iraq, there will be a corresponding shift of U.S. forces to close support roles. There's no fixed point for complete withdrawal, and thus security will be maintained. Tonight we will hear from experts in military affairs, history, and political science who will present reasoned positions that support both of these simple things. There will be rational argument tonight, no spin, no crafted sound bites. We will bear in mind that war is a matter of vital importance to the survival of the state, and we will study it as thoroughly as possible here on Neutral Ground. So let's begin. First with the affirmative argument, and call Mr. Irigaray first expert, Dr. Michael Musser, Professor of International Relations, School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth.
Mr. Curtis, Mr. McClure, Dr. Moser, my first question to you, sir, deals with Iraqi security and whether or not we should expect Iraq to be responsible for its own security.
Of course we should. And in fact, not only should we expect, we need Iraqis to be responsible for their own security. We need the government of Iraq to be responsible for its own security as a stable, functioning, representative government. And one of the core functions of a stable, functioning, representative government in that region, or in any region for that matter, is to be responsible for external sovereignty. It should be able to defend itself. It should be able to defend its borders. It should be responsible for its own security.
In the process of permitting Iraq to develop its own security, does the term external strategic threat mean something to you?
Absolutely. The region that Iraq is located in has been characterized by a number of different pundits as being a pretty rough neighborhood. This is no surprise to anybody who's studied the region or has even looked at it from afar. Every state has difficulties with maintaining its what we call external sovereignty, the ability to defend itself. Strategically, Iraq has challenges, not only defending itself, but defending its internal sovereignty, the borders, its security within its own borders. We could argue that those challenges owe as much to our presence as they do to the absence. So we could say that the government of Iraq is legal in international law. The government of Iraq is sovereign. We handed over control in Iraq years ago. And yet we cannot say that Iraq is in charge of its foreign policy. We cannot say that Iraq is in charge of its internal security. The government of Iraq is not yet fully internally sovereign.
Doctor, what is the term strategic overwatch?
Strategic overwatch, the use of U.S. forces to protect Iraq against external threats.
Is the proposition that we remove combat troops from Iraq the equivalent of losing the war on terror?
It's a very good question, and in fact, that overly simplifies the question. In fact, it frames the debate far too narrowly. This is a very complex issue that it's multifaceted. It has many different parameters. One, we're not talking necessarily about a rapid withdrawal, and I'm sure my counterpart will talk more exclusively and more definitively on the military option here. But strategically, we are spending, and we, as our proposal lays out, 19 months in slowly withdrawing from Iraq. It has very little to do with framing the debate as, if we leave, we lose. The second thing we need to remember is that strategic overwatch does not imply that we pull troops back to the U.S. homeland. Strategic overwatch implies that you pull U.S. combat forces to border regions, either Kuwait or Qatar or other states within the region who recognize that our presence is still necessary, but not necessarily in Iraq itself.
Can you tell us, please, sir, what considerations as a strategist you have taken into account to suggest that a withdrawal within a specific time period is in the best interest of the United States?
Essentially, a withdrawal within a fixed time period serves as what we would call a forcing function for the Iraqis. Until now, the Iraqis have not necessarily had to sit and develop internal security policies on their own. When we present to them a timetable, it allows them, and in fact forces them, to begin to take actions that are in their own best interest, in the interest of the region, and in the interest of the international community.
If we follow a strategic withdrawal. Does that improve our ability to more intelligently battle international terrorism?
Another excellent question. We should actually think about reframing the war in Iraq as merely a campaign within the overall war on terror. In reality, and you've heard this said by a number of military experts as well as policy experts, Iraq may be the central front in the war on terror, but Iraq is not the war on terror itself. We can reposition forces, we can shift forces within a campaign and not necessarily, quote-unquote, lose the war. The war, we need to repurpose, re-engage on other fronts within the war on terror. Karl von Clausewitz, a 19th century Prussian, doesn't seem very relevant to 2008, and it's far more complex than I can give justice to in a short amount of time that I've got here. But let me briefly explain his most famous dictum, that war is policy by other means. In other words, war is not merely fought by the military element of national power, it's fought by the entire society itself. We are engaged in this war on terror, the central front of the war on terror in Iraq, as much economically, informationally, diplomatically, as we are militarily. If you think about those characteristics, that actually spells something. It's an acronym called DIME, and we need to engage every element of U.S. national power in this fight. Right now we're focused on the military element of national power. When we think about it economically, we realize that we're as much in this economically as we are in any other way.
Thank you, Dr. Moser.
Thank you, Mr. Irigaray. As you prepare for cross-examination, Fred McClure, can I ask you a question? Are they ready? Are the Iraqi security forces ready? We hear so much that they are not. Will they ever be?
The Iraqi security forces, are they ready? Is a question that doesn't necessarily have a good answer. It depends. The answer is as much in the question as it is. There isn't an objective answer to that question. They are as ready as they need to be to take on internal security. If we consider security to be internal, if we consider security to be a policing function rather than an external security function, if we are training the Iraqi forces to maintain and defeat threats from within rather than arguable, debatable threats from without, we know there's a threat from within. We know there's a threat to internal Iraqi security. We train the Iraqis, and we have in fact been training the Iraqi army to handle internal security, to serve as the arm of the Iraqi government that can handle that. Then yes, they're ready.
Mr. McClure.
Dr. Moser, if we cannot define a time frame within, or a measurement that can be used to determine when they're ready, then how do we just pick this date and leave, given the fact that we have not evaluated the effectiveness of their ability to defend their own borders, less known their ability to get along with each other, given the sectarian difficulties that exist within that country?
I would actually flip the question entirely and say that if we don't set a date, how will we ever know that they will be ready?
But what are we measuring it by?
You're getting
Are we measuring it? Are we measuring it by something that says, okay, we're out of here in 16 months? Does it have anything to do, for example, with amnesty or reconciliation or reintegration? Can we do all of that in 16 months?
No, the Iraqis need to do that on their own. The Iraqis need to begin the process of amnesty, reconciliation, and reintegration. Now, they haven't been because they have been able to watch us take care of their events, take care of their actions for them. If you think about this, it's really actually not all that difficult to understand why more progress hasn't been made in the Iraqi government. Because we have been there doing what they should be doing on their own while we've been able to essentially clean up after them, helping them, or in some respects, forcing them apart.
But they haven't dealt with economic issues having to do with the rich, vast oil resources that they have. That's kind of part of the problem. They haven't done anything to deal with any repatriation in terms of some of the folks who've been displaced. They've not done anything in terms of having elections that are going to be, we just kind of keep scooting that one down the road. I mean, what measurements are we going to use to determine whether or not they're ready? Because I think that's the question. Are they ready? Not, will they be ready in 16 months?
What you're getting at is the distinction that we often make, the difference between measures of effectiveness and measures of performance. Measures of effectiveness, are we doing the right things? And measures of performance, are we doing things right? And if you ask the Iraqis to come up with, are you doing the right things, they'll give you a lot of different answers. Because whose right is right? Is it ours? Or do we set the standards for them? Do we say, you need to do it this way because we told you to? You have an election, purple finger, it's all good, democracy rules. Or do we say, you need to do it the way that you have in the culture and in the history of Iraq and say this is the right way. That is a difference between measure of effectiveness and measure of performance. When we say you are correct, that you are pursuing, because if you think about the national election law was just passed last week. On our timetable, that doesn't seem very effective, but on their timetable, it actually is.
Well, you raised a question early on in your testimony, what was in the best interest of the United States? I think we need to raise the question of what's in the best interest of the Iraqi people and the region. Thank you, Mr. Curtis.
Mr. McClure, you may step down. Thank you, Dr. Musser. Next question for the proposition is our expert, Brigadier General Bill Weber, U.S. Army, retired.
Mr. Curtis, Mr. McClure, ladies and gentlemen, General Weber, we've been discussing this issue of withdrawal. Would you please, in military terms, describe or define what that process is?
Sure. I think it's important that we frame the definition of withdrawal of combat forces pretty clearly, because you get different descriptions and definitions depending on what argument or what audience and who you're talking to. In my view, what we're talking about is the removal of combat forces principally from Iraq. The general line of thinking is that we will still need some support structure there to support the Iraqi army logistically and with some special operations capabilities perhaps, which may or may not include U.S. special operation forces, but clearly would include some capabilities along the intelligence lines and other lines of support that the Iraqis would not be capable of doing for themselves.
Dr. Weber, excuse me, General Weber, the process, the military process of shifting from combat operations to a strategic overwatch, may that be accomplished in the time period that we've suggested?
Well, I think so. I mean, because assuming that you arrive at some decision here within the next 6 to 8 months, it allows planners adequate time to position and posture forces in the right places, and then to begin the plan to withdraw forces as well in a methodical and logical sequence and course of events. So it's not terribly difficult. Planners do it very well all the time. The armed forces of the United States are best equipped and best trained to do this. We do this for a living, frankly, and our logisticians do a great job. And our operational planners do this routinely day in and day out. So to answer your question, sir, it's fairly simple. It's not a complex process as long as you have adequate planning time to set the logistics requirements up that you need to shift those numbers of forces and withdraw forces or reposition them. It's not terribly difficult.
General Weber, assuming that we are successful in removing our combat troops, setting up strategic overwatch so that we can help with the security of Iraq from external influence, what do you anticipate as an expert in the Arab world regarding the relationship between Iraq, Iran, perhaps Turkey with the Turks to the north? What is it that you expect the region to look like if we pull out?
It's an interesting question, and it requires some knowledge of Middle East history, particularly over the last 35 to 40 years, I would argue. If you recall, we used to be the largest supporter of Iran, which was viewed as a counterbalance to Iraqi intentions in the region to dominate the region, which explains our clear support to the Shah and the Iranian armed forces. Clearly, history redefines itself, and history is doomed to repeat itself as well, I might add. But historically, I believe, once the U.S. leaves the region, leaves Iraq in large numbers, what you'll see is a return to the historical animosity that's always existed between Iranians and Iraqis. And again, in a historical context, Iraqis consider themselves as Arabs first, and then Iraqis second. The Iranians essentially feel the same way. They're Persians first, and they're Iranians second, they're Shia third. So if you understand the religious history and the religious background of the region, I think what you'll see is a friction between Iraq and Iran develop again. And what you've seen here recently between the Iraqi Shia and Iran just happens to be an anomaly, I think, in their history between Arabs and Persians because of the opportunity to seize on a common objective, which is anti-U.S. sentiment and presence, if you will. Secondly, I think you'll see a return of regional balance of power struggles. You've got Saudi Arabia now in the mix, but it's a fairly small country. Iraq and Iran are the largest countries in terms of resources and population. So you'll see another friction developing between Arab states and Iran on a regional power struggle basis. I think also you'll see the remnants of Al-Qaeda that still exist in Iraq. There are only several hundred by the best intelligence estimates right now, but those elements will essentially leave Iraq because they're not wanted by the Iraqi people. So that part of the terrorist problem in Iraq will essentially evaporate. And then lastly, I think you'll see some reconciliation between the Iraqi groups that are struggling between and amongst themselves start to take place because, once again, the focus of their attention being anti-U.S. presence or anti-U.S. sentiment will be reduced once we leave.
And finally, General Weber, based upon all the information that you've been able to review, examine, and study, would you recommend that the United States withdraw its combat troops from Iraq by May of 2010?
Well, I think, as we alluded to earlier, it provides a mark on the wall for people to get serious about planning for withdrawal and the after effects of that withdrawal. So I think the conditions today can allow us to put a mark on the wall today that will essentially force people to start planning on our eventual withdrawal. Whether or not those conditions remain, they could get better, which would lead to an earlier withdrawal potentially. They could get worse, which could lead to a decision to move that withdrawal later. We've heard our general officers in the theater talk about that. But in my view, as Mike eloquently described earlier, it provides a forcing function, if you will, to get the Iraqi government to move forward on issues that, frankly, they've been a bit obstinate and slow in responding to.
Thank you, General.
Mr. Irigaray, Fred McClure, your cross.
General, thank you. You mentioned the fact that in your historical view of the Middle East and sort of who we sort of had as our friends back in the 80s. And I'm reminded of a particular incident having to do with sort of like a fixed date. I'm reminded of inauguration day in 1981. And just as President Carter had left office and President Reagan had assumed office, the hostages were released. Why don't we think we'll have something like this in terms of the beginning of violence again, a huge resurgence, if in May of 2010 we're gone, we're out of there?
I think the best response to your question, sir, would be why would there be a resurgence of violence? The civil war, such as it is or was or continues to be in Iraq, depending on your point of view, between the various factions within Iraq are focused on each other, but I would argue that the reasons for those factions fighting each other in a civil war that, frankly, the United States, by our presence, underwrote in terms of their security to allow them to do that, those reasons are essentially slipping further and further behind and no longer valid. The Shia-Sunni groups are starting to reconcile within the political process in Iraq. Essentially, they've spent themselves as well militarily. You saw the same thing in the Balkans, for example. Warfare takes on a life of its own, but it also dies its own death when people just get tired of fighting. And the resources, perhaps, that support peoples to fight eventually evaporate or go away.
Well, let's take it outside the border. What about their next-door neighbors?
Which
the
one?
Folks who, well, let's take, for example, where Al-Qaeda may be hanging out now, Pakistan.
I would argue Pakistan is not really a relevant factor in the discussion of our presence and withdrawal from Iraq. But I believe Al-Qaeda is looking for a new base in which to operate from. Pakistan right now allows them the best opportunity to do that. They tried to establish a base in Iraq through their own ineptitude and the response from U.S. forces and others, and the Iraqi people principally. Al-Qaeda overstepped their bounds and has been essentially crushed as an element of friction.
How can we be assured that we're going to leave Iraq in May of 2010 strong enough to be able to suppress what is arguably, I guess, a wounded Al-Qaeda now, but yet perhaps resurgent and regrouping and ready to come at it from another direction once we're gone?
I don't know that you can ever answer that question until we leave. One of the arguments that I struggle with is the Iraqi security forces essentially number less than 1 million people. When you take all of the security forces and combine them, Army, police, border security, whatever it is, the requirements there number less than 1 million people. We've been working at this for 5-6 years now, trying to train, man, and equip an army and a security element of less than 1 million people. If you reflect back, our Army in 1940 was 130,000 people. In 1945, we had built an armed forces of over 9 million people. If we could do that in America within a 4 or 5 year period, I don't understand how the Iraqis have problems doing that for themselves.
Which is why, General, I would argue
that the United States is doing it for them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. McClure, General. Thank you. You may step down. Mr. McClure, you're up. You can present the negative case, as we call your first expert, Dr. Peter Schifferle, Director of War College Fellowship, School of Advanced Military Studies.
Dr. Schifferle, thank you for being with us tonight. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a veteran of 24 years in the United States Army, a veteran of Desert Storm and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Retired in 2000, pursued a PhD at KU, something about Jayhawks, and have been teaching at SAMS, the School of Advanced Military Studies, since 1997.
Well, Doctor, I know you've been sort of watching this region that we're discussing tonight. Does the United States have any sort of legal responsibility to establish certain conditions for disengagement in Iraq?
The United States is required to perform what is called the law of land warfare in accordance with international treaties. The law of land warfare requires an occupying force to safeguard the health and welfare of the citizens of the country that they are occupying. We have that as a legal responsibility still. We are also under the mandate of 16 UN Security Council resolutions passed since the invasion in the spring of 2003. And those 16 resolutions are, generally speaking, cover the same language about the responsibilities of the multinational force in Iraq. We also are in Iraq only at the invitation of the Iraqi government, who really are the government that is sovereign in Iraq and have the responsibility to ask the UN to remove its multinational force when they think they're ready.
Okay, well, it seems as though we have some legal responsibilities we've not yet met, but yet some standards which we can apply, something to judge it against. Do we have any moral or ethical responsibilities?
I think we have two. The first moral and ethical responsibility we have in Iraq is to undo the damage that we caused by our mistakes in the spring and summer of 2003 and our long-lasting inability to cope with the emerging insurgency in Iraq in 2004, 5, and 6. It was only with the surge and a change in strategy that we accepted our responsibility to actually do what the law of land warfare requires and take care of the Iraqi people. The second ethical responsibility I believe we have is to the blood and treasure of the United States of America, the 4,000 lives we have spent in Iraq, and the need that we have to safeguard the United States, because it is only through success in Iraq that we can safeguard the United States from further terrorist attacks.
Legal, moral, ethical responsibilities. So how do we know when these responsibilities have been met?
It's pretty straightforward. It's laid out in those 16 United Nations Security Council resolutions. They require the formation of a sovereign government in Iraq. They require the safeguarding of human rights in Iraq, a significant step forward. They require freedom of expression in Iraq. They require legal and judicial reform in Iraq. In a word, they require Iraq become a modern nation state.
Well, I guess then There's this one final question for you. Have we accomplished what it is we set out to do?
No.
Well, where should we be headed?
We should be headed in the direction the United Nations require us to be headed. Of course, as the sole superpower, we had something to do with the writing of the UNSCR resolutions. However, since they now help us, I think we should follow them. What they require is that Iraq become a modern nation state, the first Arab nation state of true modernity that will lead a wave of reform through the Arab world, which, oh, by the way, is the source of the terrorists who struck us on 9/11.
Thank you, Dr. Shepard.
Well, Doctor, aren't you setting up a situation where we'll never leave?
If it requires the safety of the United States to maintain a presence in Iraq, like we have in Germany, Japan, South Korea, and probably other countries, I don't see that an issue.
The McCain Doctrine.
I wouldn't specify 100 years.
Thank you. Mr. Irigaray, your witness.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Did I understand you correctly to say that our duty is to set up a modern nation state in Iraq?
It is our duty if we are to protect the American citizens from Islamic Arab fundamental terrorists.
What about all the other nations around the world that are not modern nation states? Do we have a responsibility to also make them modern?
According to the United Nations Development Program, which has since 2002 issued annual reports on the Arab human development, the Arab world, 22 nations stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf of Iran, the Arab world is the least modernized and yet most sophisticated set of nations in the world. Their modernity threatens, their lack of modernity threatens their ability to be competitive in the modern world, and therefore we see the terrorists.
Who's going to pay for doing this, for the investment to make Iraq a modern state?
The question has a simple answer but a more extended response.
Well, but I'm interested in who do you believe is going to be responsible for that payment?
You are.
You and I as taxpayers?
Yes.
With a national debt that as of September 27th was $9,853,342,805,039.
Are you sure of those numbers?
And increasing at a rate of $2.32 billion a day. How much more do you suggest we need to spend in Iraq to achieve the goals you have indicated?
To paraphrase the earlier comment by one of your witnesses about the ability of the United States to raise a 9 million men and women armed force in the Army in World War II, if you looked at the budgets we were required to support in World War II, the number you just quoted down to the penny is nothing compared to what we did in our last war of national existence.
But you would agree, would you not, that the threat that Hitler posed to the world, the threat that was with the Axis powers, is very different from what we see in Iraq, a nation that does not have a military right now, a nation that we can certainly keep under control by a strategic observance, having allies surrounding the country, and the ability to act in the case that we needed to intervene. It's a very different situation from World War II, is it not?
Yes, it is. It's more intense and more sophisticated. The enemy is not in Iraq. The enemy is the crumbling of the Arab world and the fact that Arab fundamental terrorists who struck us on 9/11 will probably soon be armed with weapons of mass destruction. Adolf Hitler was a threat. He was a conventional threat. He was a state. We took him on. We defeated him. A non-nation state threat armed with weapons of mass destruction and a need to strike the United States of America is not Adolf Hitler. It is worse.
You're not suggesting, are you, that Iraq was responsible for the attack of 9/11?
No.
You're not suggesting that Iraq is the home of Al-Qaeda, are you?
No.
And you do understand that the reason Al-Qaeda is in Iraq is because we're there.
And I'd rather they were there than in Lawrence, Kansas.
Well, I understand that that's your choice, and I agree with that. But you would agree with me, would you not, that once we depart Iraq, the purpose for al-Qaeda in Iraq becomes void?
It's not the issue. The issue is the nature of the Arab world,
Well,
and
whether
the
or
need to
not
bring
you
them into
think it's
modernity.
the issue, whether or not you think it's the issue, answer my question, please. You would agree that once we remove our combat troops from Iraq, al-Qaeda in Iraq no longer has a purpose?
No, I disagree.
You would believe then that al-Qaeda would thrive in Iraq without an American presence?
In the current state of affairs, yes.
And that current state of affairs exists because we're there?
No.
Thank you, Doctor. Let's call our second expert for the negative argument, Colonel Michael Sebchak. Mr. McClure.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Colonel, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yes, sir. Last year in 2007, I retired from active duty after serving for 32 years. I deployed with the CJTF-7, 5th Corps out of Germany, and I commanded a logistical support brigade during OIF-1 2003 and 2004.
So you're used to dealing with big stuff.
Yes,
lots
sir.
of people, lots of material.
Yes,
Colonel,
sir.
given your expertise in military operations, and most recently as a brigade commander in Iraq, what's your perspective on an unconditional disengagement in Iraq, time certain, date deadline?
Let me answer that by quoting a great American from right across the river here. Mark Twain said, "It ain't what you know that gets you in trouble. It's not what you don't know that gets you in trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so." Any discussion we have on the advantages, disadvantages of setting a specific timeline for combat forces to leave Iraq has to consider what Clausewitz termed as the fog of war. That is, uncertainty, ambiguity, and the unexpected second and third order effects that dominate every military situation and are especially prevalent in a counterinsurgency we find ourselves in Iraq. That's why setting a specific date for U.S. forces to depart Iraq should be resisted in favor of establishing political, economic, military conditions for that departure.
Let's talk about the political and economic conditions, if you will.
Okay, sir. Iraq politically has three parochial political parties: the Sunni, the Shia, the Kurd. We've not had a second election. And in one small perspective, this or triple aspect of Iraq politics permeates everything that happens in Iraq. The first election in 2005, instead of choosing specific candidates, the people of Iraq backed political parties, often without knowing who the candidates were, even by name, who they are. The electoral lists were not released. The result, Iraqi government unaccountable and unanswerable to the people. In 2009, the elections may or may not fix this essential problem. If it doesn't fix it, we should stay until it is fixed.
What about the economics?
Economically, I think that one of the best ways to stifle or eliminate critical foreign investment Iraq so desperately needs would be to announce a random, arbitrary date that says, we will be living in 16 months. Think about your own portfolio. Would you invest in Iraq knowing that the Americans are going to leave? I think if you're honest, anyone would say, absolutely not. They want the stability, they want the conditions met.
Military.
I'm reminded of Mao's treatise on guerrilla warfare. We'll wait till the day after. If the enemy advances, we'll retreat. If the enemy attacks, we'll withdraw. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, many other adversaries are just waiting for a time. They will roll up and they will say, 16 months from now, we're going to attack the Americans at that point. A fixed date could significantly hinder any military commander's ability to pursue missions on the ground as he focuses on pulling different organizations out.
Extensive logistics background you have. Can we do it with this fixed deadline of 16 months from now?
Fred, I think that option is tremendously risky. There's a danger in this policy saying all combat forces. Well, our logistical forces are combat forces every bit as much as our maneuver forces, our artillery forces, and our other forces. If we leave 50,000 logistical forces and air forces to provide overwatch of the Iraqis, what have we really accomplished politically? The Iraqi sheiks, citizens, are going to see the same massive American forces in Iraq, and I think we get nothing for it. I'm very skeptical that the Iraqi forces, Iraqi security forces, can logistically arm, fuel, fix, move, sustain their forces in combat with what they have now, and I'm very doubtful that in May of 2010 they can resolve this, particularly with incursions from a potential adversary in Iran, or perhaps Syria, or it's a very dangerous reason.
Thank you, Colonel.
Cross-examination, Mr. Irigaray.
Colonel, I was interested by your comment about foreign investment in Iraq, and that how would anyone be willing to invest in Iraq if there was a date for departure. But did you happen to read about the Chinese recently signing a very large and significant contract with Iraq to develop their oil fields?
I did. I'm very well aware of that. I think that is directly result of a 5-brigade surge, 135,000-man army that we are providing the types of security.
And do you think that the Chinese are going to abandon that contract if we announce to the world that in order to save $10 billion a week, however we wish a month, which is the cost of the war, that the Chinese are going to withdraw?
I don't know the answer to that. That's the fog of war. That's complexity and ambiguity. I wouldn't say what goes on in the minds of the Chinese. However, I would say that if the Chinese knew we were leaving 16 months from now, I think it's very unlikely that the Iraqi government would have gotten those kinds of loans, because the security environment would be just too ambiguous and too dangerous. My thoughts.
You were answering a question posed by Mr. McClure, in which he used the term unconditional withdrawal. That's not part of our argument. You understand that, do you not?
Sure, and I also understand the strategic overwatch with forces in perhaps Qatar, Kuwait, other places, naval forces out in the Persian Gulf, absolutely.
So the proposition is not a hurried, unplanned, irresponsible withdrawal, but rather a systematic approach to attempt to reduce, first, the American expense in the region, B, increase the security from Iraq from external sources, and at the same time put the responsibility on Iraqis for their own security. Correct?
I understand. I'm not sure if there's a question.
Well, my point is, if what I understand you to say is true, is that the Iraqis are not ready to assume their own security.
Absolutely. I believe combat forces, and I believe particularly logistics, they are not ready. And if you're considering external attacks, incredibly complex and really tough to do national and theater level logistics.
So your proposition is, or your response to the issue is, rather than to set an affirmative date as a goal for us to remove our combat troops from Iraq, you would leave it up in the air without any interest in putting pressure on Iraq to, in other words, step up to the plate and do what is right for their own country.
Not at all. I think we should put pressure on Iraq. Don't get me wrong. There are many issues in Iraq that are so much bigger than they're a bunch of lazy people who aren't really getting after it. They're trying hard. Federal acquisition rules. We have 100,000 contractors to sustain our efforts. It's tough business that takes years and years, and it's not that they're not trying, it's just really hard to do these theater-level logistical type operations, and they need time. That's all I'm saying. It should be conditions-based. When they are ready, when they meet the conditions, we as a nation say, fine, we're going to draw half our forces, then we're going to draw 3/4 of our forces, and then we're out.
And is it your position, just like the last witness, that our responsibility is to leave a modern democratic state in Iraq?
Not a Jeffersonian democracy, but an Iraq which is accountable to its elected officials. I believe that's in the region and the nation's best interest.
That was certainly not what we were told was the mission for the war originally, was it?
You know, things change.
No, I understand.
And just like the fog of war, nailing that jello so it doesn't drip is really hard. We call that mission creep in the Army, and believe me, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, they're well aware that mission has creeped and changed. That's a political question, sir.
And war is a political question.
Thanks so much. Now we hear closing arguments from Mr. McClure.
Mr. Curtis, Mr. Arreguín-Garay, ladies and gentlemen, there are no guarantees in Iraq. But if we limit the flexibility of our leverage by establishing arbitrary, unconditional withdrawal timelines, we substantially increase the risk that some semblance of stability in Iraq, and in turn the Arab world, will be beyond our grasp. The United States has legal, moral, and ethical responsibilities that remain unmet, whether it's the law of land warfare, the UN Security Council mandate, or the invitation of the Iraqi sovereign government. On the moral and ethical front, protecting the U.S. vital national interests, fixing our own mistakes, and reducing the expenditure of our national treasuries of both lives and dollars remain priorities, and they are our responsibility. But the only leverage in a stated date of withdrawal is the statement itself. That's all. Experience tells us that simple unilateral challenges don't work in an Arab culture that is steeped in negotiation and steeped in compromise. However, if we precipitously withdraw from an unstable Iraq, the potential for escalated violence increases dramatically. Such an unconditional withdrawal places ethnic strife, competing militias, internal territorial disputes, terrorist attacks, and yes, maybe even coups squarely on the table. A precipitous withdrawal from Iraq without conditions that can be observed and measured, makes the prospect of foreign incursions or other types of regional intervention more than just likely. Walking away from Iraq is not merely a question of removing American troops, brigade by brigade, airplane by airplane, tank by tank. Our policy, which is condition-based, must beg and answer one question. In what condition will we leave the country of Iraq, its people, and the Arab world at large? We will have accomplished what we set out to do when the changes in Iraq provide current and future generations with political voice, social choices, and economic opportunities that they need to build a better future for themselves and their families. Only then will the Arab states be able to join the global information society and the economy as full partners.
Thank you, Fred McClure, for your vigorous advocacy. That represents one side of our proposition tonight. The other, Pedro Arreguín-Garay, your closing.
Mr. Curtis, Mr. McClure, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight for this important debate. The opposition would have you believe that we have the capacity, the means, to create an Iraq that resembles our nation. That's simply not possible. We are all different. That type of a paternalistic attitude simply will not work. Iraq must be allowed to become an independent and sovereign nation. And the sooner Iraq is given that responsibility, the more lives we're going to save, and the better we're going to be economically. We cannot continue the expense that we have in Iraq today. either in blood or treasure. Further, history teaches us that once we leave Iraq, not in an unconditional, not in a rush manner, as has been argued, but rather in a systematic approach, relying on the best of military strategies available to us, people like General Weber and Dr. Moser, we will be able to see Iraq retain its status as a sovereign nation. Are there going to be problems in Iraq? I'm sure there are going to be problems in Iraq. We are not going to prevent that, even if we stay there 100 years. Our interest in Iraq is no longer met by our combat troops' presence. It's a destabilizing effect. We are breeding more terrorists every day by our presence in Iraq. We are being resented by the Muslim world at a time when we should be focused on Pakistan, at a time when we should be focused in Afghanistan, areas where we know we can have a military influence that will provide results for our nation. The idea that to continue to remain in Iraq is of benefit to us is bankrupt. We must not remain in Iraq for the unforeseeable future. By telling the Iraqi people we are leaving on a specific day, we show that we are not occupiers. We are liberators. We came in and we're telling the Arab world, we don't want your lands. We're not going to take your oil. You have a right to be a free and independent nation. This is not a crusade. We went in there for a few goals. We have completed them. It is time to allow the Iraqi people to take the responsibility that we as Americans took on for ourselves. Remember, the king once said we were not ready to rule our colonies. Let the Iraqi people be responsible for themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Irigaray, and thank you, advocates and our experts tonight. Thank you all for joining us here at the Robert J. Dole Institute as we present Neutral Ground. All U.S. combat forces should be withdrawn from Iraq by May 2010. I'm Bill Curtis for the Dole Institute. Good night.